stage, so I'm going to give you my 2 nuclear jokes that I can only do in this kind of a crowd. So the first one is, what's the favorite lunch for nuclear engineers?
Favorite what?
Favorite lunch is fish and chips. And then in California, we talk a lot about fusion cuisine. What constitutes fusion cuisine for a nuclear engineer? This might not be good for the fusion people, but it's we end up putting more energy in than we take out. I have to say I do like fusion, so I won't stick to that one. Okay, this research has been sponsored by Anthropocene as well as UC Berkeley, where I have an affiliation. And as we got into this detail, and I'll talk a little bit more about this research project, just in the interest of time, I know we're running behind, so I'm going to try to stay on schedule. These presentations and the dashboards will be available to everybody after, and I look forward to getting your feedback, because we have scoured a lot of data sources. I've been trying to check against all the different presentations, and there's a few discrepancies here and there, which I think are interesting, which I'll take back to the team. And we have created something between the academic group and Anthropocene that we call System 3 Research Insights. So this is just the first time we're using that logo. But I thought I'd start, because this is part of a larger research effort to get down at a granular level to understand a little bit more about the costs and the economic benefits. You heard from Guido earlier, who's one of my colleagues, about some of the benefits that we're working on. This presentation will focus just on the costs, and specifically overnight construction costs, financing costs, and operating costs. And to set the stage, I went back and looked at the data for Diablo Canyon. So this is something that just got, or it's a plant in California that got an extension. And there's a lot of quibbles with the data around the inflation adjustments, but I thought it was interesting. If you go back and look at the build, it turned out to be about $7,600 per kilowatt of capacity. That's on an inflation adjusted basis. And right now, the operating cost is about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So you have something that actually took quite a long time to build, and there's an interesting history, which if you're interested, I recommend you looking at, because they had some trouble around understanding the geological faults, and there were some debates about the safety, and this is all in the 70s and early 80s. And what I find interesting is we're having the same conversations now. We're having the same debates now, and we're almost 40 years later. But maybe that's just how it goes. Then I looked at, we looked at the data for France and the US, and these numbers don't entirely align with the previous presentation. I was looking at that, but I think the order of magnitude is about right. And the thing to understand is the unit cost, again, some questions about exchange rate and some of those issues. For the French reactor, fairly recently, I guess it's about 12 years ago, but this was almost $10,000 per kilowatt. And then we know about Vogel, which depending on how you do the calculation, is well over $14,000 per kilowatt. And so when I present these types of data in the US and to some extent in Europe, I do find a lot of the pushback is around cost. And what I want to do today is show that in Asia, we have a different story. And this is what we think is quite interesting. Now, I often give this presentation in situations where people are still coming to grips with the debate around nuclear. And the advocates, we've heard this in the presentations, talk about the lower emissions, the lower costs once they get built, the smaller land footprint, etc. The detractors used to talk a lot about the risk. I don't hear that quite so much anymore. It's more about the economics. So this is really why we're focused now on trying to understand those economics at a granular level to provide a little more understanding for those people who are having the debate. Because I find a lot of people throw numbers around. I've actually been quite happy with this conference because people are very focused on real data. They're just not making, the presenters here are not making these assertions without much data backup. And what we're trying to do in Anthropocene and with this current effort is to understand globally at a granular level what are those costs and breaking out across all the different components, and then pull as much data as we can, which ranges from government data to proprietary data to what's often called unstructured data. So this is just things like PDF documents. So the idea is to try to create the best source of granular data on existing nuclear power plants that are operating and are under construction. So I put my email address up there, for those of you that have data or questions, and look forward to hearing from many of you. I won't go through this. This is for a lot of people who don't understand the definitions of Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4 reactors. I think this crowd kind of understands that. So I'm going to shift now to the actual analysis, and this is where the rest of this presentation is going to provide a little more color behind a lot of this data. But this is really the conclusion to start with. When we look at the reactors that have been built in China, as well as some that are under construction, what we're finding is, again, depending on how you deal with the exchange rates, that the actual cost per kilowatt of capacity is closer to about $2,000, or somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a kilowatt of capacity. So that's quite a bit different than what we're seeing in Western Europe. And what's interesting, I'll show as we get into it later, there's a fair amount of variation underneath that number. So there are some higher cost reactors, such as the high temperature reactor, which is a Gen 4 reactor. And then you have the more typical, like the Chinese version of the AP1000, CAP1000, which is coming in at much lower costs than even this. And as we shift to some of the other countries in Asia, such as India, we're seeing a similar cost structure. Oh, and I should mention that the operating costs, that data is really hard to get. So this is based on some estimates, and I think it might be a little bit low, because I've been looking at some recent data. It might be closer to 5 or 6 cents, again, depending on how you calculate the exchange rate per kilowatt hour. But order of magnitude, this is still very low relative to other kinds of energy. Although when you look at the different energy sources, often coal still comes in at a lower number in terms of direct cost. But we all know we're not accounting for the environmental costs. So that's something that's got to be handled vis-a-vis government regulation to internalize those externalities. But just to try to give you an idea. Now, what's great about once you get a reactor built, though, as has been discussed, you might have that reactor operate for as much as 80 years, or even I've talked to some people who think even 100 years, so that might be pushing it. But that means that this infrastructure can be very robust over time. Anyways, we get to India and Korea. To a first approximation, it's a similar type of cost structure. Roughly $2,000 to $3,000 per kilowatt of capacity for the construction costs. And I should mention that these numbers reflect both overnight construction costs, so that's just the straight cost of constructing the reactors, and the financing costs. Now what's interesting about that is the financing costs differ quite a bit across country, but the final number seems to be about the same. So that's kind of interesting. The Chinese have much lower reported financing costs than some of these other countries, for example. Now, if we, I probably won't have time to go through all of this data, but this is available for those that are interested to get into a little more of the detail behind those cost numbers. And if we look at it across reactor generation, that's where we start seeing some differences. Not surprisingly, the newer reactors are much more expensive, just given the fact that you don't have the same kind of experience. You're working on first of a kind, or maybe second of a kind, And so you're still trying to understand the engineering. Now, a couple of things that were interesting as we were looking at this data over time is that the Chinese were able to massively reduce their costs as they shifted from reliance on foreign assistance. So some of the earlier builds had more foreign contractors, people from the outside. As they're shifting to more of an internal vertical supply chain stack, that reduces the cost. So that's one thing. On the other side, it was interesting, after the Fukushima event, the tsunami in 2011, the costs in China also went up for reactor development, and at least per the local language reports that our team could read, it seemed that they were unilaterally deciding to add more safety to the reactor construction, which added to the cost. So I mention that only because it's interesting how an event in another country can affect the cost profile in a different country. And so that's something that is a bit of an issue. Now, in the United States, one of the problems, at least I understand from talking to nuclear engineers, is that it's overkill on the safety, which massively increases the cost. And so there's some balance that needs to be struck, I think predominantly in Western Europe. Now, I don't know if we can say that's been struck here in these Asian builds, maybe, but definitely it's a different cost structure, and as far as I understand, not necessarily dangerous, with respect to some of these risks that people talk about for nuclear power plants. Now, I should mention that I find a lot of the risk calculus in this space to be hard to understand. Now, I'm originally a risk modeler for large financial institutions, so that's kind of where I learned how to do quantitative analysis. And almost no analysis is as conservative as what I find in this industry. So that I think that's something that maybe that's an education issue. We have to think collectively as the industry in this space, like how do we push forward a better understanding of risk? I mean, one of the examples I often use is aviation. We had over 70 people die recently in the United States because of plane crashes. You don't hear people talking about changing the way that we do aviation. You don't hear them talking about shutting down the entire world with respect to airplanes. And we realize that will continue. We will continue to have low frequency, high severity events. That's the risk that we have to incur to live in a modern economy. And I think that same mentality needs to shift to energy. Now, if we look at some of the data, and just in the interest of time, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but this provides some idea of the break between the overnight construction costs and the financing costs. So here you see for China, it's roughly it's an 80-20 split. And if you look at the construction durations, we were seeing numbers that were on the order of 74 months, although I think that's biased too high going forward, only because a lot of the longer builds are in the past. So we expect going forward, the construction durations will fall closer to that, the 51 month number. And then if you adjust the unit cost by capacity, so the things to the left have lower capacity, and you can see that Gen 4 reactor at the top. This is kind of the newer reactors. They are more expensive per kilowatt capacity. You would expect that, but it is interesting to see kind of the magnitude of that difference. I'll skip through some of these. This is just showing some specific reactors in China where they were shifting from completely local build versus bringing in people from the outside. And then if we compare across different types of energy sources, you're still finding, if you include all the different taxes and fees that they're putting into prices, that coal, still slightly cheaper, hydro's cheaper, but everything else is more expensive than nuclear. And we would expect that to go down as time goes on. Now, as we shift to India, it's a different picture with respect to just the scale. They don't have as many operational reactors. You do have a more even split between overnight construction costs and the financing costs, probably related to also the labor cost is cheaper, but a similar cost structure. And actually, little longer build time, well, quite a bit longer build times on average, but if you look at the shorter duration build times, not that different to a first approximation. So around 60 months versus, I think the fastest in China was about 51 months. And then this is an example of an actual plant operating in India where we were able to pull the operating data. And you can see that it's similarly low cost, somewhere between 3 and 6 cents, again, depending on how you do the exchange rate. And I should mention that that's really been a big problem trying to put this on the same currency. Because in the last 10 years, the currency volatility with respect to exchange rates has been very high. You know, so you have like, now I think it's like 90 rupees to the dollar. You know, there are times when it was closer to 40. So you have to take that into account when you're doing this. And we have our own methodology we put in the appendix. For those of you that are interested, can look at that later. And then you see for the various energy sources here, you know, hydro, again, cheaper, coal is cheaper, but gas is more expensive than nuclear. Again, we would expect this to continue to trend down. Now for South Korea, a little closer to the China situation, kind of sits in between India and China, 70% on the overnight construction cost versus 30% for the financing. Not quite as many reactors you can see, but again, a similar cost structure, which I do find that interesting. I mean, there was nothing about this data that would suggest we get similar numbers out the back end. There's just the data that we collected. A similar picture to what we see in China for the build time, and again, trending toward the faster build. And then this is an example of an actual reactor, the Seoul reactor that we were able to pull data for, and you can see, you know, some of the details around the breakdown of that cost that looks fairly similar to what you see in China, again, the first approximation. Looking at different energy sources, again, similar picture to what we see with some of the others, where you know, nuclear comes toward the lower end, but not necessarily always the lowest. Although I'll repeat, not accounting for the negative externalities. Now, if we look at this is a little bit of a different analysis. You know, Korea's electricity analysis, or electricity generation is about 25%. Nuclear, that compares to just under 10% for the globe. But it does give you an idea of maybe hopefully the trend for these different countries. And then finally, we have some of the next generation reactors that are under development. There are SMRs that are being developed, high temperature reactors, different than the pressurized water reactors that are under development. One of the things that's striking about the Chinese nuclear program, which has already been discussed, is just the range of things that they're working on. So I find that quite interesting. And then there's in India, the milestones have been pushed out. So that, that was something else that we found, as well as for most of the world. I can't remember, somebody brought up Cesare Marchetti yesterday, and he's somebody I like to read as well. But I find it interesting that he was predicting we'd be much closer to having a lot more nuclear now than we actually do. So we are behind as we discussed. And then Korea, also has, moderately ambitious plan associated for, future development. Just a comment on fusion. It is interesting. These three countries are all part of the ITER consortium that's currently underway in France. So there is some fusion work that's underway. And as I mentioned, both Gen 4 and SMR development in China. And then a fast breeder reactor prototype that we saw that's being under development in India. And then some SMR designs under development in South Korea. So the interesting thing about the new reactor development is that I think that we have an issue. I see this much more in the venture capital community in the United States. There's so many different designs for SMRs. To some extent, that's creating a problem for the regulatory authorities because they're having to certify so many different designs. And I think it would be in the best interest of the industry to get a little more collaborative in terms of figuring out, what's a smaller subset of designs that will work in SMR space. That's also true here in Asia because you have these three countries doing very different things in this new reactor space. But I do want to mention that the big focus of this presentation is to move us away from a U.S. and Western kind of myopic focus on nuclear because a lot of things happening in this region of the world at a different cost structure that is quite or should generate more optimism. And it continues to demonstrate the benefits of this type of power. And so in the end, just again, a request to all of you that might have access to data, or if you disagree with the data that we have, if you could contact me or somebody on our team, I'd appreciate that. And we'll continue to go forward to try to build up this database to make it a little more transparent about all the different costs associated with building nuclear power plants. With that, I will finish.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe time for a question or two, but I just want you quickly, you mentioned that China had become much more conservative on safety issues. I was just wondering what drove it. Was that the Fukushima?
It wasn't Fukushima.
Accident.
Well, that was at least for the local language material we had, that was the explanation.
Right, I see. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. A very good presentation. So just one clarification. I saw in the slide in India that you included I think fuel handling or spent fuel handling and commissioning. But for the rest, do they include
they do. Yes, that's also included. In fact, that for the operating costs, that often the allocated cost for that will change that final number that will be charged to the users of the electricity.
Okay, thank you very much. In the interest Francois, okay, final question then, yeah.
Yes, no, just one small remark about the construction time. You've written it's 51, around 50, you want to...
Well, that was the shortest one.
But I just want to say that it's increasing, in fact, it's not increasing. And it seems to have reached a kind of a plateau. And the first Hualong was 60 months, and the last Hualong opened in January is 62 months. And in between there has been the Fangchenggang case by 78 months. So it's stable. It's not decreasing. And I have one question. You didn't mention there is a very big difference in cost per kilowatt between China and the US, for instance, or Europe. And you didn't mention the main reason for that. My opinion is that is the financial cost, which nearly does not exist in China.
Yes.
So, but do you agree with that?
I agree. Well, I agree with that, and I also think that they get different costs allocated. I'm speaking more for the U.S., specific to some of the maintenance and upkeep in a way that may be overkill. So that, but I do agree with you.
And Francois, sorry, why is the construction time going up? You said it's increasing. Is that a safety issue?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. But one of the explanations about the supply chain. For the first units, the supply chain are ready in advance. For instance, I have seen for the CAP 1400, the steam generators, extremely heavy, 1,700 tons and 40 meters high. And they were ready, and each of them is probably 25 million or 30 million US dollars cost. And they were ready 2.5 years before being shipped to the place. And for the new construction, they are not in such a hurry to show that they are successful. So in fact, they build all these big elements upon demand, and doing as in the West, following the schedule, oh yes, maybe in 1 year we'll be reaching this stage, so we order such and such heavy equipment, and they don't order in advance, so that they can save capital. And as a result, it takes 2 months a year, 3 months a year. So finally, the overall time is not decreasing.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jeff, thank you for that excellent presentation. Any questions, maybe afterwards you could catch him during the break or before he leaves today. So thank you very much. So now we're going to move